the stage for St. Elizabeth's, and then talk about the history of the hospital and its relevance in psychiatry and the law. Now, since antiquity, some people have not been considered accountable or fully accountable for their actions when they have broken the law. Special considerations can be found across civilizations for minors, for people with intellectual disabilities, for actions that were thought to be irrational and involuntary. For example, in this paragraph here, a jurist of the Middle Imperial Age of ancient Rome says that an individual who killed his own mother may not be punished and can be excused if there is no simulation there, and if somebody is gonna keep a close eye on him. The corollary here is that whoever does that, meaning the relatives, will be punished if they don't do it properly. So this idea of the unsound mind makes its way through the Middle Ages in Europe and gets to England, where in the 13th century, the Chief Justice devises the wild beast test, meaning that a defendant who is so bereft of sanity that his understanding of his behavior are no more than an infant, a brute, or a wild beast may be not responsible for the crimes. And so on this basis, insanity is established at this time. But it's not until much later, it's not until the 19th century, that the matter of legal accountability comes to be construed in some cases as a medical problem. And that alienists, as psychiatrists were known at the time, are regarded as having the specific knowledge, expertise to help the courts make such decision. And so the matter makes it to the medical literature. And in 1803, Thomas Percival, an English physician, in the influential textbook Medical Ethics, defines the essence of medical expert testimony, saying that it requires the medical expert to scrutinize the whole truth. And a few decades later, the medical journal Lancet addresses a question that is always relevant. Where is the line of demarcation between bad behavior, fanaticism, and actual insanity? Now, before 1800, people who committed crimes, where they were mentally ill or not, more likely ended up in prisons. The first insanity equity to be detained in a mental, to be committed to a mental institution was James Hetfield in 1800. And it took an act of the British Parliament to make that happen, an ad hoc law, the Criminal Lunatics Act. And so he ended up at Bethlehem Hospital, the first asylum to be built. So there were some cases of this nature. The most famous and consequential was that of Daniel McNaughton, famous and consequential because the insanity test that then kept being used for the next 100 years or more was named after him. So person is not responsible for his actions when laboring under such a defect of reason from disease of the mind as not to know the nature and quality of the act, or not to know that it was wrong. Now, this was the time of moral treatment of the mentally ill, which was codified at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century in Europe. Moral causes, which we would now call environmental and social factors, and mainly the impact of urban living and industrial development, were thought to be the causes of more of mental and physical ailments. And the solution was to remove diseased people, vulnerable people from the stressful circumstances and have them recover in asylums. The ingredients of these asylums, of this moral treatment, were supposed to be pleasant surroundings, entertainment, recreation, and occupation. And let's cross the ocean and come to what was at the time a very young nation, the United States of America. Now, the American Republic was a revolutionary departure from the monarchies of the old world. And for doctors and lawyers, there was an opportunity there to get rid of the guilds based on class of the old world and to establish a merit-based system. And it was an opportunity to work with each other, doctors and lawyers, and to work in this new type of state. And Dr. Benjamin Rush, an alienist, i.e. a psychiatrist of the time, was a perfect example. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was very close to Thomas Jefferson. And he was a big proponent of medical jurisprudence, as you can see here from this list of goals. He was attributing to medical jurisprudence a quasi-salvific quality. So multiple factors contributed to shape the intersection of mental health care and the law in the United States in the 19th century. Moral treatment, the concern of the state governments with the citizens' mental health as part of a larger commitment to public health, an awareness of the social role of professional expertise, the advent of marketplace professionalism as a result of the developing market economy, especially during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. So American judges increasingly relied on independent medical witnesses, and issues related to medical jurisprudence made their way through American literature. And a milestone in this regard was the publication in 1838 of the Treatise on the Medical Jurisprudence of Insanity by Isaac Ray. Issues about insanity dominated the field of legal medicine, but also important and overlooked, but actually very lucrative opportunity for the medical experts at the time was that of the evaluation of testamentary capacity, where the theories of insanity were applied to guard against poor judgment associated with age and illness and protect the transfer of economic assets from one generation to the next. Case here that I have included in the slides, I've included it because it was prosecuted by the future president, Abraham Lincoln, who as a prosecutor actually lost the case because this was an individual, an inmate who murdered the prison warden and claimed that he had done that as a result of an overdose on chloroform that he had been given for a surgical procedure, and actually won and was committed to an asylum. Now, before asylum were built in America, the mentally ill, of course, were often found in prisons and almshouses, which were the homeless shelters of the time. And the first facility to be built for the mentally ill was the Virginia's Eastern Lunatic Asylum in Williamsburg, 1773. And in the next 100 years, every state had at least one such institution. 13 superintendents of these state asylums met in Philadelphia and founded a professional organization in 1844. 108 years later and 2 name changes later, that group is now known as the American Psychiatric Association. In 1851, the members adopted rules to establish mental institutions. And Dr. Kirkbride, one of these superintendents, wrote them up and published them in a book in 1854. And so the Kirkbride plan and moral treatment provided the blueprint for the creation of dozens of asylums in the following decades, including our St. Elizabeth's Hospital. I want to point out that there was an alternative view at the time, and Dr. John Galt was perhaps the main proponent, having published about the same time a pamphlet in which he argued in favor of a more balanced, community-oriented approach to the care of the mentally ill. And the Reformist National Association for the Protection of the Insane and the Prevention of Insanity was actually created to criticize the Kirkbride plan and the asylum's orthodoxy. Nonetheless, for the next century, the mentally ill were institutionalized. The orthodoxy prevailed. And we get finally to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, or as it was called at the time, officially Government Hospital for the Insane. And in a male-dominated world, we come to an outstanding woman who is our founder, Dorothea Dix, an outstanding advocate over time for the mentally ill. She was born on the main frontier, had a rather unhappy childhood, was raised eventually by a grandmother who left her a small legacy to live on, and she was drawn early on to social causes. She was teaching Sunday school to women in jail and almshouses, and realized how badly treated they were, and she realized that they were mentally ill, many of them, and they just needed help. And so she started visiting jail after jail and almshouse after almshouse all over the country. And she had an extraordinary ability to mobilize and organize and win the inertia of legislators and people in government. And so was able to, was successful in establishing many asylums, including St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the district. The take-home message here is that institutions like St. Elizabeth's Hospital were born out of compassion and out of outrage for the plight of the mentally ill confined in prisons or left to fend for themselves at the margins of society. So in 1852, Congress appropriated sum of money for the construction and furnishing of a mental hospital. And the US president himself and the Secretary of Interior spent a couple of days trying to find in the outskirts of DC the right place to do that. But eventually decided that a doctor needed to be hired to make all the decisions. And so Charles Nichols was hired and came from New York, where he was already working in an asylum, was appointed the first superintendent, initially worked as essentially a general contractor. And in 1855, finally, the hospital, called the Government Hospital for the Insane, was open. And the seventh admission was the first forensic admission of our hospital. It was a Richard Lawrence who 20 years earlier had attempted to murder President Andrew Jackson unsuccessfully. And he had been committed to a facility in Maryland after being found, after being acquitted. And was in Maryland. The district was paying, of course, for him and many others because it didn't have a mental institution. So the case of Richard Lawrence was had been prosecuted by Francis Scott Key, who, of course, is better known as the author of the American national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. And by a twist of fate, the first successfully temporary insanity defense in the district in 1859 involved the son of Francis Scott Key, who was murdered by a congressman who was convinced that he was having an affair with his wife. So moral treatment at St. Elizabeth's Hospital had all the characteristics that one would expect. Now, these early asylums were communities that tried to be self-sufficient, self-reliant. They tried to make in-house food and all kinds of items that they need. And so they grew into villages and then small towns. And another important fact about our hospital in the early days was the connection with the US military. For the first 90 years of its life, St. Elizabeth's Hospital has been a military hospital as well. And during the Civil War, it really functioned as a general hospital where majority of the soldiers who were admitted really were not mentally ill. They were treated for physical ailments. And when they wrote home, they didn't like to say that they were at the government hospital for the insane. So they used the vernacular name of St. Elizabeth's Hospital after the name of the old colonial land grant in which the hospital was built. It wasn't until 1916 that Congress changed officially the name, adopting the vernacular St. Elizabeth's Hospital. There were many problems since the get-go: overcrowding, underfunding, and also all these problems went directly to Congress, because the US Congress had oversight of St. Elizabeth's. So there were congressional investigations, and at some point after some of these investigations, Dr. Nichols decided he had enough and left and went back to New York. And so we have the second superintendent of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Dr. Goding, who was a big reformer and big believer in smaller, less expensive buildings for the mentally ill. And that's what he did. That was the Goding plan. He was also a believer in more freedom of recreation and exercise for the patients, relying less on drugs and restraints. Now, but overcrowding, of course, continued to be a problem and will be a recurrent theme here. Now, Goding and Nichols were called as expert witnesses by the defense in the case of Charles Guiteau, who in 1881 shot US President Garfield. President Garfield didn't die right away. He died after a couple of months of agony. So Goding was consulted by the defense as an expert. It's interesting that he wrote in his journal that if the president dies, Guiteau will certainly be executed. If the president leaves, there is no doubt that he will end up in an asylum. So this was his expectations. The president did die, and Guiteau was indeed found guilty and executed. And then there was an autopsy, a brain autopsy, and the results suggested that he had syphilis. And this prompted Dr. Goding to establish the first pathology lab in a mental hospital in the United States. And Dr. Blackburn was appointed to direct it and turned it into, over time, into a premier neuropathology center. Now, in the early 1880s, the US Congress decided that insane federal prisoners be transferred to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. So a plan was made to make a separate forensic hospital, so to separate forensic and non-forensic patients after that. And Howard Hall was built. Howard Hall, the new forensic hospital, opened in 1889, named after John Howard, a social and criminal justice reformer who lived and wrote in England in the 18th century. Well, that was a welcome addition to the hospital, but it didn't take long to realize that it wasn't enough, and so that there was an increased need for forensic services, and so right away there was an expansion of Howard Hall. There were many other changes and many other new things during the Godding era, the 1880s and 1890s, at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. A school of nursing was established, dentists were hired, substantial improvement in the landscape with hundreds of trees planted, more sophisticated entertainment programs all year long, with a paid orchestra on staff. And yet problems continued. At the end of the century, at the turn of the century, a tour guide described the hospital as a garden of beauty, one of the most attractive parks within the district. Perhaps an exaggeration, but there may have been some truth there. Now, after Godding's death, President McKinley picked Dr. Alonzo Richardson to be the third superintendent at the hospital from his own state, Ohio. And Dr. Richardson happened to be also the private psychiatrist of the First Lady, wife of President McKinley. His tenure was brief, but very impactful, partly because he was able to secure at the time, huge appropriation. So a lot of new buildings were built after that, and they even built a railroad to connect the power plant with the riverfront, and they bought a locomotive. And by 1903, the patient population was up to in the 2000s. And that's when the tenure of Dr. William Alanson White started, over 30 years here of tenure. He was 33 when he became superintendent. And the patient population would grow to the 5,000s by the time he died in 1937. And with him, St. Elizabeth's Hospital entered the 20th century scientific era of psychiatry. He was an educator and a scholar, first and foremost. He introduced Freud's psychoanalytic technique. The first woman psychiatrist took office during his tenure, Dr. Mary O'Malley, in 1905. The first psychology department in a public mental hospital was established with Dr. Franz as the first director. It was all about research and training, not clinical work for psychologists at the time. The Red Cross ran welfare and entertainment programs at St. Elizabeth's. There was a new med-surg hospital with 6 operating theaters, various specialties. And there was the Washington Post. and sometimes news from St. Elizabeth's were not good, and security issues were always, always front and center when they happened. So in 1911, the Washington Post reported that a plot in Howard Hall, the forensic hospital, was fortunately discovered and didn't go through, but these patients intended to kill the attendants and escape. So it was felt that more security was needed, and a wall was constructed around Howard Hall, the forensic hospital. And this is how it looked in 1922 with the wall all around. And this is how it looked inside the wall. There were patients tending, to the vegetable garden. Now, Dr. White was a big scholar, and he also wrote about forensic matters. Now, some of these would not be publishable these days, sterilization of criminals, but that was 1917. And it was not just Dr. White, but there were other psychiatrists here who were involved in forensic scholarship. And Dr. White and some of his collaborators were also involved in high-profile events, and for example, they were expert witnesses in the case of Leopold and Lowe, which was called the crime of the century. These two young men kidnapped and murdered a child in cold blood. They confessed, they were caught, they confessed. And so the goal of the defense was never to exonerate. The defense didn't go for an insanity acquittal here, but they wanted to use the psychiatrist expert witnesses as to mitigate the sentence. And the prosecution objected to that, saying that the testimony of the psychiatrist would be admissible only if the defendants claimed insanity. But the judge sided with the defense, and eventually the two individuals were found guilty, but they get life sentences. They got life sentences instead of death, which was the whole point. And we come to the fifth superintendent, Winfred Overholser, taking over in 1937, appointed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. This is the time when American psychiatry gradually shifts to a more progressive stance, and Overholser himself was a cautious reformer. He oversaw at St. Elizabeth's the introduction of new forms of treatment, both non-pharmacological and pharmacological, but also allowed increased city privileges for patients and new concepts of care centered around social rehabilitation. So psychodrama at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, art and dance therapy, but also very much with the 1950s, really the psychopharmacology era. And in 1946, St. Elizabeth's Hospital ended this was the end of the military era. No more military admissions. The VA system was established that year. Now, he was a big scholar himself, and he was a forensic psychiatrist. So this is just a sample of his forensic work. And of course, other psychiatrists at St. Elizabeth's Hospital were involved in forensic scholarship, including Edison Duval, who was the first president of the Washington Psychiatric Society. Now, Overholser was the last of these superintendents that were sort of like father figures. He was a big public figure in DC, sort of a celebrity. He was nicknamed the Baron of Anacostia. Now, these early superintendents used to live in the center building and occupied in an apartment that was 8,000 square foot, and they had up to 4 servants. But overcrowding is a recurring theme here, and of course comes back in this time. Now, a case that was very high profile was that of Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was a acclaimed American poet and an author. He was also a big fascist, and during World War II, while living in Italy, he was doing anti-US propaganda for the Axis. So he was indicted for treason, and in 1945 he was captured and incarcerated. And he went for the mental health defense. And so a court-appointed panel, including Dr. Overholser, opined that he was mentally incompetent to stand trial. Eventually, he was found to be of unsound mind, committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, where he was in Howard Hall, the forensic hospital, but then was moved to nicer part of the hospital and was given all kind of privileges. He was treated well. He was here for 12 years, and he received important guests, including Hemingway. And these important friends campaigned to secure his release. So in 1957, the Department of Justice dropped the charges. He was released, returned to Italy, and this is how he saluted the press as the fascist that he still was. And so Dr. Fuller Torrey, a psychiatrist at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a iconoclastic figure, researched the case and concluded that the whole thing was a charade. That was his opinion. No, 1948, again, during Overholser era, new class of forensic inpatients is created by Congress, passing the sexual psychopath statute of the district. So individuals committed under this act were confined were committed to the Howard Hall, the forensic hospital of St. E's. Now, this was the constitutionality of this commitment was challenged in court right away, but the court maintained it. For example, in Miller v. Overholser, the court requested that the individual be transferred to a proper place where he could get treatment, but still kept at St. Elizabeth's. 1954 is when the Durham test for criminal responsibility was introduced in the district. It lasted until 1972. Before that, it was a McNaughton rule district test, the legal test of insanity. And there were some landmark cases. For example, in Overholser v. Leach, the court endorsed more stringent commitment procedures for criminal acquittees. They call them an exceptional class. And in Lynch v. Overholser, the court decided that commitment to a mental institutions applied only to individuals who had relied on who had affirmatively relied on the insanity defense during their trial. There were a lot of good things happening at Howard Hall, a lot of innovative programs, therapeutic and rehabilitative. But on the other side, there were security problems, and there was overcrowding and all the ramifications of that. And it was felt that a new facility, a bigger facility, was needed. And so 1959 is when John Howard Pavilion, which some of us remember, John Howard Pavilion was opened in 1959, but was here until this new hospital was built much later. So that's the new forensic hospital, 1959, and that was one of the last achievements of Superintendent Overholser, who retired in 1962. Really, the end of an era at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and in American psychiatry, and the beginning of a new era. This is when 180 degrees change happened, and this is the beginning of deinstitutionalization, a multifactorial and multidimensional process fueled by new progressive ideas, the fact that new medications, new treatments were available. It really was summarized in the Community Mental Health Act of the Kennedy administration, part of the New Frontier, all geared towards community care, outpatient care of the mentally ill. And in 1965, the Social Security Administration Act defunded the long-term chronic care of the mentally ill in asylums. So what followed was the closure or the shrinking of asylums, including St. Elizabeth's. And just like, a century earlier, not everybody agreed with the institutionalization of the mentally ill, and there were other views. Not everybody agreed with the institutionalization of the mentally ill the way it was happening. And in 1973, Dr. Treffert, superintendent of one of these disappearing asylums, even managed to publish a one-page letter on the American Journal of Psychiatry, saying that yes, they had their rights on this mentally ill, but they were dying out there. But the patients' right movements, the disability rights movement had very solid and long-standing roots. Books and articles had been written for decades. It was not a new thing in the 1960s. And this is really the era of modern forensic psychiatrists out of the intellectual ferment of the 60s and early 80s, and the ethical understandings, the emphasis on human rights and disability rights, and really the challenge of medical authority and expertise that came out of that. And so this is when actually AAPL, the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, was established. Dr. Candilis, as was said before, is the new president set to take office in October. AAPL was really created to reshape the field and strengthen the scientific foundation and regain influence and authority, but through professionalism, expertise, integrity, and protecting the vulnerable people. And back to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, we're going to have, I think, 8 superintendents in the next 25 years until the end of the federal time of the hospital. So 5 in the first 110 years, 8 in the following 25 years. So the hospital was clearly shrinking, and yet the forensic services were growing. and the need for forensic services was growing. And so by 1967, the hospital had over 500 forensic patients and many more on convalescent leave and unauthorized leave. And there are a couple of of landmark cases that have Dr. Cameron's, the superintendents of this time, names on. The right to treatment for insanity equities in Rouse v. Cameron, insanity equities and sexual psychopaths, as they were called. And the case Lake v. Cameron that defines the least restrictive alternative standard. Now, Rouse, Lake, these were patients who were at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And here's the list of the superintendents of this era. Some of us will recognize Roger Peel here. And Superintendent Harris, known for the Bolton v. Harris case. This is the case of where the Bolton report, Bolton evaluation, Bolton report comes from. The government has to prove the need of the insanity equity to be confined, to be committed inpatient at the hospital within 50 days from the acquittal. And also we recognize the name of Dr. Robinson, after whom the education wing of our hospital is named. First African-American superintendent of the hospital, also a pioneer in the diagnosis and treatment of deaf and mute with mental illness. The 1970s were a time of change in the district and everywhere else. The sexual psychopath laws fell out of favor. The ALI, American Law Institute, insanity standard was applied in the district, 1972, so end of the Durham rule. Time of change, the Superior Court of the District of Columbia was established in the 1970s. There was an overall reorganization of forensic services in response to the increased involvement of the mentally ill in the criminal justice system and the resulting need for more and more pretrial evaluations of competence to stand trial. So a screening office was established at the DC Superior Court. All forensic inpatient services were consolidated within John Howard Pavilion in a configuration that some of us will remember, the 12 wards of John Howard Pavilion. Yet the problems with the backlog of defendants that were awaiting inpatient evaluation didn't get any better. And the Judge August established the Mental Health Committee on Pretrial Evaluations to explore what the possible solution could be. One of the recommendations that was acted on was to create a forensic psychiatric unit on the grounds of the DC General Hospital, the former site of Gallinger Hospital. Our CEO, Mark Chastang, was the CEO of the DC General Hospital, but later, I think, in the 90s. You may remember this unit if it was still there. Now, our Forensic Review Board was established in these years, today led valiantly by Dr. Shilpa Krishnan, and we will recognize, some of us, the name of Joseph Hanneberry, who was already in 1965 the forensic administrator of John Howard and continued to be the administrators until the early 2000s. And we will also recognize tragically, the name of John Marr, who a psychiatric nursing assistant who was murdered in 1976 by a patient of John Howard, and is memorialized in the education wing of the hospital. We come to the 1980s, and I have a couple of cases here with far-reaching consequences, cases involving individuals in the district. This is the U.S. Supreme Court, Jones v. U.S. Here the Supreme Court supports the commitment of insanity equities in the district, and also establishes that there is no necessary correlation between the length of the equities hypothetical criminal sentence and the length of time necessary for his recovery. Insanity equity can spend much more time at the hospital if it's needed than what his hypothetical sentence, if he had been found guilty, would be. And so as a result of that, less and less defendants went for the insanity defense, and only those who faced serious felony charges after that. And the other famous case here that was very consequential with regard to the insanity defense was, of course, that of John Hinckley, who attempted to assassinate President Reagan and was found not guilty by reason of insanity under the LAI in 1982, under the LAI standards, which put the burden of proof on the government to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was not insane. There was a big reaction to this upheaval, and Congress promulgated an Insanity Defense Reform Act that kind of shifted the burden on the defense, made it much more difficult to prove an insanity defense, to win an insanity defense case. Well, many administrative changes have occurred through the history of the hospital, and I think Dr. Candilis mentioned it, that for 20 years our hospital was under the National Institute of Health, National Institute of Mental Health. This was when the first neuroimaging studies in psychiatry were done by Dr. Weinberg and others at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And as the federal government defunded asylums, including this one, the District of Columbia ended up shouldering more and more the cost of mental health, and yet St. Elizabeth's Hospital remained under federal control. And so there was a bit of a tug of war that went on for several decades here. Eventually, it was President Reagan, the Reagan administration, that decided to transfer the hospital to the district, signing this into an act in 1984 to be effective in 1987 under Mayor Barry. That's when the hospital became part of the district government. Fast forward to our days here, the new hospital was opening in 2010. This is where we work and live. The West Campus remained federal and has become the headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security and Coast Guard. The East Campus of the old hospital that we are part of is now a new neighborhood of the district, and we're very glad to see new things coming up. We have a new general hospital, the Cedar Hill Hospital, set to open in a few weeks, I believe on April 15th. We have the Care First Sports and Entertainment Arena, residential building, retail, the Whitman Walker Clinic, a lot of new life for this old place. Now I'm moving here to the end, and I want to offer a few final thoughts. We have seen two large and one-directional movements in this history. The institutionalization of the mentally ill and then the institutionalization. There were opposing views, there were discontents, but the progress went in one direction, for 100 years, and then there was a 180 degrees. We have now a situation which we see less and less community hospitals, psychiatry beds. There aren't very good economic incentives for community hospitals to have inpatient psychiatric treatment. The length of stay has been reduced as a result of managed care in these hospitals. And of course, the asylums are no more, and the tertiary care psychiatric beds have decreased. Conversely, the involvement of the mentally ill in the criminal justice system has increased, and the need for pretrial forensic services and pretrial beds has increased. And so many of our admissions, and in other hospitals like ours, is the same in the country, are filled by this pretrial forensic admissions. So these are some of the challenges that we face here. And, I like this quote of President Eisenhower, its farewell address. He talks about the need for progress, but also the needs for balance. And the lack of balance leads to not good outcomes. And in this famous speech, he decried the military industrial complex. So I jokingly wonder if we have created here a sort of a competency to stand trial industrial complex. My thoughts are that we do need more community psychiatry hospital beds, and we need actually bigger hospitals like this, and maybe a little bit of that old moral treatment, or at least the aspirations and the spirit of it back. And we need a forensic continuum of care that includes outpatient, inpatient, and jail-based pretrial forensic services, and more fluid system. And we need to test hypotheses to have a data-driven approach, but also a sense of history and an ability, or at least an effort, to integrate opposing thoughts and feelings in order to have both progress and balance. So, final thought for the people who lived and died, and some of them were buried, on these grounds. There are two cemeteries on the campus of St. Elizabeth's. And for those who are interested in history, the history of the hospital, the General Service Administration provides a monthly free tour on the West Campus, where the Department of Homeland Security is. This is the old center building that's been preserved beautifully, and it's the facade of the headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security. And this is the view that can be seen from that, probably one of the best views of Washington, D.C. It can be seen from there. And I'll stop right here.
Thank you, Dr. Swardi. I've been here a long time, and I learned so much about the hospital from your presentation. When I have new students and residents and trainees joining in St.